Thanks everybody for coming to our talk. Robert Palmer is kind of the co-designer of the module that we teach at the Open University. There's also one other victim, which was Thomas Cheney. He's at the moment, he moved to Northumbria. But essentially what we do in the Open University, well, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about sort of space law in context. Space law, as it turns out, is kind of a big part of it's a part of international law. So how big is it? Thanks to the Outer Space Treaty and Article 3, it basically, the entire international law fits into space law, and space law is basically one of its branches. I hope PJ will agree with me. Yeah, good. Sure. Sure. What does it mean in terms of teaching space law? It means that you kind of have to teach a little bit of international law to get to the space laws part, and then that's one of the things that we did with the Open University, is to try to make space law part of international law, so that we teach both as it is. It is considered a specialized regime, meaning that it is a special regime within international law. So it's kind of a Latin term is lex specialis, meaning that it takes the basics of international law, so the sources, customs treaties, general principles, and kind of uses them to create a regime of how humanity should act in outer space. It's quite broad. It has 5 core treaties, one of them which is defunct in the sense that there's only 19 signatories. It never came into force. So technically, there are 4 core treaties and a wannabe. We kind of go through and teach through that, but because it's a treaty and it's a kind of a sort of a part of a specialized regime, you have to first teach students what a treaty is, what a custom is, how do they develop, how do they work within an international society. If the slides are shared, this picture has a hyperlink and it will take you to this sort of a booklet, which is essentially has the core treaties and the core UN resolutions, and finishes with the Artemis Accords. The reason why this is that Chris Satterfield, who's a commander and sort of an astronaut, interesting that the existing space law fits within this little booklet. No, it doesn't. It's essentially all of international law is part of space, or part of outer space. So you have to kind of mention all of that, as I said before, to get to teach space law. We talk a little bit about the whole thing about what is general and what is special about space. Because I'm going to talk a little bit now about how sort of we teach space law at the OU. If you're aware about the OU, we're of course a long distance provider, which means that we take the long distance learning approach seriously, in the sense that the student is an independent learner, and we prepare materials and activities, et cetera, to facilitate the learning of the student. It's a bit of a different model of teaching and learning than what you would find in your traditional universities, although a lot of universities are adopting similar to this model. The way that the current module kind of came about was there was a new degree program at the law school for the Open University. Originally, it was supposed to be a space governance course, and then somebody figured out that we also don't have anything on international law. Sorry, we don't have anything on environmental law, so they decided to smush it together and put it in front of my plate. And what we decided to do was to teach both environmental and space law using as sort of examples of international law. So students will know a whole lot of holistic approach towards international law. They will learn a lot about international governance. They will learn about how to use data to test out certain trends in international governance, which is very scary for lawyers. So we try to kind of ease them into using data to test out how international governance is working or isn't. And then we take them through the different aspects of governance in both environmental law and space law. Luckily for us, environmental and space law share a lot of commonalities in the sense that they are a lot of UN-led, and there's no international court. There's a lot of governance mechanisms going through that. So we kind of put environmental themes through our sort of space law. So we talk a lot. We talk some on space debris and space debris management. We also talk some on planetary protection and terraforming, and we talk a lot about the tragedy of the commons, which is essentially what is going on in space law at the moment. So students have 3 assessment points. We've tried to do what the previous speaker talked about, which is try to get them to talk about environment and space to a non-academic audience at first, and get them to sort of discuss more critical and synthesized issues of space law and space governance, finishing with a sort of a simulation of writing a post note to Parliament, which can be on a theme of space law or sort of environmental law. And students kind of seem to like that approach, and sort of it's kind of preparing students to go into the area of policy making and sort of policy understanding, especially with the final assessment, because that is sort of where kind of a bit of the space law and space policy is directly. So they need to be aware of that discourse, and they need to be able to sort of kind of participate in it. TJ?
Sure, I have this one here.
All right.
I can drop the mic when I'm done. So what I'll do here is, let's swap a second. Abbott and Costello up here. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm at Durham University now, and interestingly, I'm not teaching right now, but I've been teaching in the space law field for 16 or 17 years, and so I've had the opportunity to teach at a lot of different universities, and also beyond just sort of the space law course, I've had the opportunity to teach specialized courses. So the first module I ever developed was space security law, which looked at military aspects of space and how we do the law for that. So what I'm going to kind of do is maybe give some reflections on kind of what the goals of law teaching are. And sort of the first idea here is, like, when we're teaching law, it's not just about teaching the students that there is this law and this is the law that you need to know, but law is often about a way of thinking, a way of interpretation, a way of approaching legal problems and solving those legal problems. I imagine this is very similar in your field, right? There's a way of thinking in which you do things. And I think that this is a very important part to recognize in law. It's not just, you know the statute now. It's, you know the statute, but you need to know how you use it. And that's a critical part to legal studies. And more broadly, I teach in the realm of law and technology. And so I'm often trying to get across to my students this notion that knowing the law isn't enough. You have to understand how technology changes things, how the changes in technology impact the law, and how the law impacts those changes in technologies. And I think that this is a really critical thing, because often we treat the law like it's static, right? It says this and that is the rule, but technology changes really fast, law changes really slow, and being able to use legal skills to deal with that problem is a really important idea. And so part of this for me is teaching students how to have the conversation with the technical end, right? I think that a lot of students now end up going into in-house counsel positions. In an in-house counsel position, you are going to talk to the engineers, you're going to talk to the information security team, and you're going to need to be able to hold your own in that conversation. So one of the things I say all the time is, look, I know enough orbital mechanics to be dangerous. And what I mean by that is that I can talk to somebody about orbits, right? I can't calculate an orbit. I really, like, as soon as you put an equation up, I fall apart. But I understand the basics of how it works, that I can ask the questions that I need to ask in order to make that legal assessment. And this is a big thing that I'm constantly trying to get across to my students, right? You have to get into the technology itself. You have to understand how these things unfold and how they impact what you're doing with the law. And so I'm going to give you a concrete example of how I've done this in the past. And so before Durham, I was at Cardiff University, and I was part of the law and technology module there. And one of the workshops that I put together was a robotics workshop. And I pulled the students together for a weekend, and I'm teaching them robotics, and like, this is part one, right? There's a lawyer up there with an Arduino being like, this is how we're gonna make a robot out of this. But this was what we did. We would start first day one, come in, here's your Arduino, let's make a little LED flash, right, with the Arduino. And when you see a law student make an LED flash, right, it's a pretty easy thing. Boy, yeah, I mean, it's amazing, right? It's incredible. Because suddenly they're understanding how code works and what code does. And so throughout the day on the first day, what we would do is do something like that, right? The first step is make the LED flash. And then we would stop and we would have a legal conversation about how code impacts law and how law impacts the development of code. Next step, let's build a basic robot with some, servo motors. And what was great is I had the code wrong, right? I was giving them the code. I had it wrong. So we all just sit down on ChatGPT and figure out where I went wrong when I wrote the code. But then another lecture. And so we moved through this notion of you're building the robot, you're understanding the technology, but at the same time, you're exploring the legal implications of that. And these were things like intellectual property law, the idea of hacking and how that is impacted by the law, the notion of open source software. All of these things get explained via them learning how to build the robot. And on day two, I brought in a box full of junk and told them that they had to build their own robot, and there's a course that you're going to have to run later in the day. And they did it. I was amazed, right? These law students built robots, and they did that. So it was all part of this notion that just because you know the law isn't enough. You have to be able to have that conversation. I think that's a really important part of this. And I also try to get rid of this notion that lawyers are there to say no, right? And we all hear this idea that lawyers are there to say no. And this notion that, are often the knee-jerk answer is, well, we need a law for this. That's not always the case, right? A lot of the time we don't need a law. And if you understand the technology, you can understand why we don't need that law and regulation. But that doesn't mean that the lawyer doesn't have a role. And so I try to get my students to understand this broader notion of what the lawyer's role is in the innovative framework that we're in, right? The law can help you deal with risks, but it can also create opportunities. And I think that's a very valuable lesson when we're teaching these types of topics. And with that, I'll cede my time.
No, that's actually a good sort of segue into, there's a lot of technology in space, so there's a lot of concepts that are foreign to lawyers. Talk about orbits, talk about microorganism contamination and all that, and sort of to lawyers who are used to briefs, to positions, whatever it is, you have to get across the idea that you're going to have to be a little bit of science, technical science literate to understand these topics properly. So yeah, it's the same, it's a very similar approach we took, which is that you talk a little bit about the technology and then you talk a lot about the governance of it.